Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel, and welcome to a mini reading vlog. This is going to be sort of a small version of the Lukewarm Vampire Autumn thing that I did last year for October, where I was just reading vampire books all month. I, several weeks ago, was at Barnes & Noble with one of my best friends and my partner, and I ended up picking up a few different short vampire books. And in particular, they're all vampire classics, so I thought it would be really fun to read them all together and just immerse myself in some of the classics, especially because one of them is a book that inspired Dracula, which I read last year and I really enjoyed it. So the books that I have are Frankenstein, which is not a vampire story. You would be correct if that was your first thought, but there are a couple of vampire stories in this particular edition, and we'll get to that in a minute. But we also have Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and this one I know is particularly influential. I know there's been a lot of Carmilla retellings recently, and there's a popular webcomic, so I've been really wanting to get around to reading it, and I've heard particularly good things about this edition that was edited by Carmen Maria Machado. So I'm really looking forward to this. And then in this one, this particular edition of Frankenstein also contains the other two stories that were written during the competition that resulted in Frankenstein, which were The Vampire by John Polidori and A Fragment by Lord Byron. So those are both vampire stories, and I have never gotten around to reading them. I've read Frankenstein multiple times, but I've never gotten to read the other fiction that came out of that competition. So I think that these are going to be really fun and interesting to read together, and I'm just really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a really fun little like spooky weekend. So that's what we're going to be doing, and I'm going to go finish up my workday. Currently kind of ending off my lunch hour, so I'm going to finish up my workday, and then I'm going to dive into some fun vampire spooky reading. It is a very like gray and dreary day, which I feel like makes it a perfect day for some vampire fiction, but apologies if you can hear lawn care stuff happening in the background. There's one of the lawn guys is out here weed whacking, and they just have impeccable timing for any time I'm about to be filming or getting on a video call. They arrive. I don't know how they manage that like every single time, but they're really good at it. But we appreciate them because that means we don't have to mow the lawn, and it's great. They do a really good job. It's just funny how often the timing coincides with me being either in a meeting or filming a video. Anyway, all of that little ramble aside, I'm back because I've read A Fragment by Lord Byron, and that was a very odd reading experience. The story itself is about 5-ish pages long, 4.5 to 5 pages, and I would say that the first half of it is, maybe not the first half, but like almost the first half, like 40%, is a very long-winded description of the unnamed narrator's kind of weird friend. And ultimately, after all of this writing, what we really know about him is he had some weird, suspicious stuff in his background. He's not very good at hiding his emotions. He's very like prone to having his emotions kind of flicker across his face. He's very like expressive. And he and the narrator became friends after the narrator kind of pushed and pushed and pushed to become his friend because he just thought this guy was kind of interesting. This guy's name is Augustus Darvel. And that's just the first chunk. It's just this like very long-winded description of Augustus Darvel. And then we find out that he and the narrator have gone on this journey because the narrator had this like aim of going on some sort of like travels to a bunch of different places that he doesn't know a lot about. Like, he just wants to go to places that have been less frequented by travelers and experience them. And so the two of them are on a trip, and the story is following them as the friend Augustus's health is deteriorating rapidly during the trip, and ultimately this little tiny bit of writing ends with him dying and leaving the unnamed narrator with a very strange request. And I think it's setting up some interesting things. I would really love to know if Lord Byron had any thoughts on like what the outcome of this ritual the unnamed narrator is asked to undertake would be. But we actually just get that. Like, we get Augustus's death, and we get the very specific things that the narrator is asked to do after his death, and then that's it. That's the end of the story. They bury him, they bury Augustus and the narrator and this other guy that's traveling with them, and that's that, the end of the story. So it's a really interesting piece of writing, and I feel like it would have made for a very cool story if Byron had ever finished it. But the vibe to me, and maybe it's just me as a reader, was that he got bored writing it because so many words to say so little information. I would also be exhausted if I was writing that many words to convey so little. But yeah, it was interesting. I'm glad that I read it. It's not clearly vampire fiction because we actually there's never like a mention of vampires. We never really learn much about Augustus. We just know he's kind of weird, and there's some weird stuff that happens with his death right at the very end. But it's like, you could see that this could be a vampire story, but I don't know if it actually is a vampire story. That was what I was kind of led to believe, but this might just be me not doing enough of my own research. It was still very interesting, and I'm glad that I've read it, and I'm intrigued to read The Vampire next, because I've heard that Lord Byron was the inspiration for the main vampire in The Vampire, for Lord Ruthven. So I am really excited to give that a try next. Here she is, the girl. She's very excited we're back. We ran some errands this morning. See if we can get this to focus on her. We ran some errands this morning, and now she is glued to one of us or the other, whoever's available. Yeah. She loves her people. She loves to be, like, social and be wherever the people are. Mostly I think she just likes to be petted, which is so valid of her. And she likes her little bed under my desk. And then we're not getting in it today. I'm glad I decided to read The Vampire around the same time as A Fragment, because it was a really interesting reading experience because there's a lot of overlap. Both stories are following a young man who becomes kind of enamored with or fascinated by a kind of odd man in his social circle, and then like pursues friendship with that person and ends up going traveling with them. And that's sort of the shape of both stories. Obviously in A Fragment we don't see anything beyond kind of the odd man's death, but we get to see a lot more of the relationship between the two characters in The Vampire. In The Vampire, it's a third-person perspective, so we're following a young man named Aubrey who's kind of a romantic. He's been left to his own devices for the most part, and so he's not very, like, knowledgeable about the world, but he's very, like, interested in, like, literature and poetry and history. And he becomes fascinated with Lord Ruthven, who is known for being kind of, like, present, but not really, like, interested or even really like seeing the things around him. He's sort of disinterested in everything, and Aubrey becomes fascinated with him in much the same way that the unnamed narrator of A Fragment becomes fascinated with Augustus Darvel. But in The Vampire, we're following them as Aubrey befriends Lord Ruthven and then goes traveling with him. And obviously we get a much more complete story because it's actually like 20 pages. It is a full short story. But I thought this was really interesting how much overlap there was in kind of the setup of both stories and the vibe of the main characters and kind of what was going on. I do really like The Vampire. I think I gave it 3 stars. I didn't really rate A Fragment because it's so short. But I'd give The Vampire like 3 stars. I think it's a solid short story, and I can see why it would have been shocking at the time that it was written. I think it's a really interesting story, and I think it's interesting the way that the vampire's like vampirism shows through in ways that aren't just like drinking blood. There's a lot of other ways in which he is like taking the life of other people, but not necessarily like literally speaking. There's a lot of like him making bets with people and then forcing them or causing them to like lose all of their money and all of their livelihood, things like that. There's also a lot of him you know, taking the innocence of young virgins, etc., etc. There's a lot of like other ways that his vampirism shows through, and I really liked the way that our main characters like slowly became suspicious of him and the ways that that had repercussions for Aubrey as the story progressed. So it was a really interesting one. I don't want to like ruin the ending for that of that one for you. If you want to pick up The Vampire, I do think it has kind of an interesting ending. It's one of those where you can kind of see what's coming, but it's the tension of it, the way that everything is ramping up and up and up that I think makes it fun, and I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was a fine reading experience. So yeah, now we are moving on to our final vampire book, Carmilla, which I'm going to go ahead and start today. Probably won't finish it today. I am planning to play some Silent Hill F with my friends later. I bought that recently. I'm very excited. It just came out and I was waiting until my next payday to buy it. Managed to get a hold of it, and now we're gonna play it. I'm so excited. Which is not vampire-y at all, but we will be diving into Carmilla very soon. I am halfway through Carmilla, and I'm not actually quite halfway. I'm almost 60 pages. It's 139 pages, so I'm almost halfway. But I'm also extending this vlog kind of into the week because, I'll be honest, I got sucked into the Minecraft rabbit hole again over the weekend, and yeah, that's where my time is going at the moment. But halfway through, I am enjoying it. I think the pacing is a little odd. The setup of this is we're following a young woman named Laura, and she and her father live in a remote area in, I think it's supposed to be like Austria, maybe? They're in a place called Styria, and I'm not sure exactly where that corresponds to on like a modern map, but that is a place that comes up quite a lot in some of the other pieces that I read for this video. So they're in Styria in this kind of remote estate, and it's pretty much just like them. The two governesses that work with Laura, one of them is like her childhood governess and the other one is like a finishing governess who's there to teach her like languages and things. So it's like the four of them, and a carriage crashes outside of the home one evening, and one of the people in the carriage gets left behind at their estate to recover. It's Carmilla, and around this time they also receive an alarming letter from a friend of theirs who lives quite a ways away, about the death of his daughter. So they're kind of dealing with that, and then Carmilla arrives and is staying with them, and that's kind of where everything kicks off. I can't really tell you much else about the plot because so far there really isn't a plot. Generally we're following Laura and Carmilla as time passes. Carmilla is expected to be with them for about 3 months before her mother and the rest of the group that was with her arrives again to pick her up. This seems like it's probably bullshit, but she's supposed to be there for 3 months, and a lot of this is sort of a like long-range overview of those 3 months and of Carmilla's behavior generally, with the occasional like zooming in to look at a specific instance of something that happened. This is being told by Laura many years after the events have happened, and I think it's interesting, and I think it's achieving what it's trying to do, but I think because of that like long-range timeline and the fact that we're having this character like looking back on it from many years later is resulting in some odd pacing choices, because I feel like very little has happened and I'm, you know, this far in. And there's not a whole lot I can really tell you about Laura or Carmilla at this point, but there are some interesting moments where Carmilla behaves strangely that we kind of get this like zoomed in focus on. So I'm enjoying those pieces of it. I like when I'm actually seeing Laura and Carmilla interacting. It's just a lot of this feels like it's, you know, a character reflecting and trying to pick out patterns many years down the road of behavior that they saw at the time. So it's interesting. I'm glad that I'm reading it, but I'm not sure what's going to happen in this like last half, given that I really don't have a sense of the direction of the story exactly. I have finally finished Carmilla, and it took me a lot longer than I anticipated given the length of the book, but I think that has a lot to do with the pacing. I think the last time I checked in I was saying that the pacing feels very slow. It's this like sort of long range 3-month timeline, and we're looking at behavior across that entire timeline. That kind of shifts in the later part, so I found the later section of the book kind of sort of the, not quite the last half, maybe a little, you know, before the halfway point to just before the ending. I found that a lot more compelling, because that section is really the main character, Laura, zooming in to look at these specific events that were happening and some things that were happening to her during Carmilla's stay. And I think that that part was a lot more engaging and a lot more creepy. There were some really unsettling moments that happen in here, particularly with like Laura having strange nightmares and having these weird bodily sensations. And I just thought that was really interesting. I really enjoyed that part of the book. That said, I think the ending is a little abrupt, given how long it takes to kind of build up to what it's, you know, wanting to tell us. And then we finally get this section of it saying, okay, here's the weird stuff that Carmilla was doing during this time. The ending feels very abrupt because we have another character pop in to tell a story about how somebody he knows experienced exactly the same thing that Laura is experiencing. And he kind of comes in with a solution, and then the solution is implemented just like that with almost no resistance at all. So I felt like that was a little abrupt and a little bit, what's the word I want? Anticlimactic, maybe, given all of the build-up to it. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I liked the writing in here, but I just think that that was a little disappointing at the end. I did like the character that it introduced with that story, but yeah, I think it was just a little bit of a disappointing ending. The other thing I found confusing in here, and this might be an effect of me not reading the introduction, which I specifically did because I had never read Carmilla before, and I know introductions often discuss spoilers of the book ahead when it's sort of, you know, an introduction written by the editor. So I specifically didn't read it, but I noticed that there are a number of footnotes throughout this book that some of them read as though they were a part of the original story, and some of them feel like editorial comments, and I can't tell, because I've never read it before, so I don't know. I can't tell if they're all from the editor, or if like some of them are from the author from the original text and some of them are from the editor. If that's the case, nothing differentiates them. And if they're all from the editor, there's a few that just feel odd because they're not really quite editorial comments, in the sense that they're not explaining something in the text or something like that. Like, there's a couple that are specifically they're longer ones that are explaining something, but there's like a couple of them that are like telling related stories, like, oh, it was once said that a serving girl lived in this manor and like this thing happened to her. And then there's another one that's like, imagine it, reader, a river of blood. That's like a description of the sky, gets that little editorial comment. But then there's another one that's talking about like a specific, I think it was like a specific social thing during this era, where there's like one that, well, there's the word upire shows up a lot, O-U-P-I-R-E, and it says a Polish vampire. So I'm kind of unclear on where the footnotes are coming from and what purpose they serve. So maybe I just need to do a little more research into the story and find out if any of these are from the original text or not, because some of them seem to be part of the story and some of them seem to be explanatory, and that was a little bit confusing. But I did really enjoy how much this pulls from some of the original myths of the vampire, which I know a little bit about. During my master's degree program, one of my classmates was a PhD student who specializes in vampire literature, and so she taught a lecture during one of my classes that was about vampire literature. It was a part of a project we were doing for that class, and I thought it was really interesting. I learned a lot about like kind of the original myths of the vampire, and I then was like recognizing that here, where it's definitely pulling from some of those older stories of vampires or vampire-like beings. So I thought that was really cool. Just overall, I think that the pacing and the ending were a little shaky. Editing Hope here. I forgot completely that there was an additional point I wanted to make about Carmilla, which is that there's a few points where I feel like it would almost make sense for this to be a multiple POV, or at least dual POV, with Laura and her father, because I think there's a sense throughout that like her father is much more in the know on what's going on, that he's doing some sort of investigations of his own in the background and trying to figure out what's going on with Carmilla, and he's like clearly got something else going on. There's also like an entire sequence of information that never gets answered, where Laura's trying to find out more about Carmilla and like where she comes from and everything, and that like sort of gets answered, but there's also like this whole other unanswered thing where there's like people traveling with her and we never find anything out about them. So there's a lot of questions I think remain unanswered, but it seems like her father kind of knows what's going on. So it feels a little bit like maybe there should have been a dual POV situation with Laura and her father, so that the reader could understand more of what was going on and get some of those answers to those questions. Also, there were some moments at the end that was like, there were some moments at the end that were making me feel like Laura was not paying attention to what was going on, because she like witnesses this really dramatic event like right in front of her face, where Carmilla does something kind of, you know, inexplicable, and she proceeds to say in the next little bit about how like she was never told what was going on and she doesn't know what's happening or what happened to Carmilla or all this stuff, and I'm just like, you weren't paying attention to the last few pages of what you just said. Like, her apparent ignorance of some of the information doesn't make sense with the information that she's reporting having seen. So a little bit feeling like Laura is too dumb to live, but you know, she's trying her best, I guess. So that's a lot to say on a book that I feel kind of mid about. I think I'm going to give it like 3.5 stars. I am glad that I've read it, and I now can, I think, engage more with like Carmilla adaptations and feel like I understand what's going on, which is great. And I'm glad that I took the time to read this. I do want to go back at some point and actually read the introduction. I may do that later today just to have the extra context and see if that gives me a better understanding of the footnote situation. But based on the story itself, it was a solid time, and I'm glad that I finally read it. So yeah, that is it. That is our mini vampire vlog. This was a really interesting experience because I feel like I didn't love any of these texts the way that I love Dracula, which is just such a weird book, but I really like seeing like the origins of the vampire, some of those earlier myths kind of coming up in this and some of the other texts. I liked tracing the connections between the other texts as well, the connections between A Fragment and the vampire. So I thought this was a really interesting experiment. Let me know down in the comments below if you enjoyed this, too, if you have read any of these and what your thoughts were on them, or if you've not read them, and you know, what do you know of that are like adaptations of them, because that's something I'm like less familiar with. I know that they are very influential, but I'm not good at keeping up with like adaptations of things. So if you know any particularly good adaptations of Carmilla or the Vampire, I would love to know about them. One that I can recommend that I have read is the Greta Helsing books, Dr. Greta Helsing by Vivian Shaw. Lord Ruthven from The Vampire is a major character in that series. So like if you're looking for a vampire, The Vampire adaptation to check out, I highly recommend that one. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have for you today. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.